Welcome to Politica, Israeli Politics Explained at a diaspora volume. I'm Sharon Offenberger in Australia, and joining me as always is my co-host Yuval from Israel. Today's episode, we're going to have a look at what is left of the left and what's right about the right. Why we've given this name to the episode is that it's tempting to dive straight into the election issues that we want to discuss on Politica podcast, but it is worth stopping to have a look at the field and specifically what are the dividing lines between Israeli voters. Is this even relevant in Israeli politics anymore? And if not, what are the new fault lines? One of the things that I wanted to start by saying is that because all Israeli governments have been coalition governments, there is sectoral politics in Israel, which means there are parties that represent just specific sectors. They do not pretend to represent or have the interest of all citizens at heart. And so those sectors are somewhat outside these definitions of left, right and centre. There are two big groups that fall into this category. One is the ultra-Orthodox or the Haredim, and the other one is the Arab sector. So they tend to vote for their own parties that they identify with. And because of this, we will do a deep dive specifically into those sectors. But for today's episode, we're going to stick to the old political language of left, centre and right, and how the Israeli electorate is categorised along these lines. Yuval, welcome. Can you help us understand Israeli political identities?
Absolutely, Sharon. So great episode today. And let's just frame the discussion that we're having today. So you very rightfully said that, we have the Haredi parties on one side and the Arab parties on the other side, where they really represent their sectorial interests. And that makes sense, to their electorates. The people we're discussing today are the rest of the Israelis, and really the common denominator amongst these people is one word. And it's a tricky word, I know, abroad these days, but of course here in Israel it's quite a defining word in terms of our identities, and these are the Zionist parties, okay? These are the self-proclaimed Zionist parties, okay? Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, don't identify as Zionists, and we can dive into that when we talk about the Haredim, because it's a very interesting definition. And of course, the Arabs in Israel, we're talking about, the 20% of Arabs who are citizens of Israel, of course, not about the rest of the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, also, by large, do not define as Zionist. So the spectrum that we're discussing today is the Zionist spectrum. So if we look at left and right on the scale of, again, the Israeli Zionist parties, the first spectrum, I would say, and this is a spectrum that can be related to, anywhere else in the world. We have the economic spectrum, okay, with left being socialist, welfare state. You have to remember Israel was, established as a socialist state, right? The founding generation of Israel was socialist, the welfare state, talking about equal opportunity, talking about worker unions, et cetera, et cetera. So the first fault line is we have, the economic spectrum of left and right. Up the drama, we have the religious fault line. We're talking about how you define within the Zionist thinking how religious Israel needs to be. And here we have, again, on the left, we have complete secular, complete, separation of state and religion. And this is LGBTQ rights, and this is marriage rights, and this is women's rights. And this is a big issue, public transportation on Shabbat. And on the religious Zionist side, we have people who want more religious education in schools, who are absolutely okay with, with no public transport on Shabbat because they think that's, that's the character of the Jewish state, who are against LGBTQ rights and against civil marriage. And what's interesting is over that line, the Israeli public is actually shifting, especially on issues like gay rights, especially on those kind of issues, is shifting towards the more secular approach. And if we look at, a leader like Naftali Bennett, who just, I remember when he was elected in 2015, when he was chosen to be the Minister of Education, there was an outcry amongst the Israeli seculars. I remember this because I was right after high school, and I was, openly queer, and I was like, how in the world can we accept the fact that we have, an education minister who is against, the LGBTQ plus community? And we see today, 10 years later, just now it's Pride Month, and he's suddenly saying that he's pro-LGBTQ rights, which is quite dramatic. So that's a dramatic shift.
Can I just ask, though, that at the same time that there may be a shift, as you said, towards more the secular side when it comes to those sorts of rights. In terms of identification, my impression is that people actually are identifying as increasingly religious.
That's also true. People are identifying as increasingly religious and more so as increasingly what we call masorati, traditional, especially the younger generations. There's been a renaissance of affiliation with Jewish tradition, where a generation before and the generation of the kibbutzim was like almost ultra-secular. Right now, what we're seeing, especially among younger generations, is a lean into tradition, but that doesn't correlate with a belief in personal freedoms. So you'll see many Israelis, okay, who are, are leaning towards Jewish tradition and Jewish heritage and lighting Shabbat candles and celebrating the holidays, and even Jewish spirituality, Kabbalah and mysticism and those kind of things are becoming trendy. But at the same time, pro-gay rights, pro-civil marriage, pro-transportation on Shabbat. It's an interesting dynamic for the religious spectrum.
So I think what you're going to get to is that the third and probably historical, at least in the last few decades, fault line has been around what we would call the peace process, what some other people might call the Palestinian issue. And I think it's worth understanding that historically the left in Israel was socialist Zionist. And then when socialism left their platform, what came in as a new defining identity in the left platform is the idea of having peace with the Palestinians. The years of the Oslo Accords, this became the defining character of the left. And in fact was so influential, I think, on the rest of the Israeli public that even the right had to compete and say, well, we will make peace with the Palestinians too, we will just do it in a different way. Ariel Sharon said that he was going to make peace with the Palestinians. I think Netanyahu said he would make peace. They just had different ideas about what that would look like. And I think on that spectrum where the left differed to the right is around the idea of compromise. Certainly right-wing that came out of Jabotinsky believed in what we call Greater Israel, or a full state between the river and the sea that would be Israel or the Jewish state. And so they were not willing to compromise on the land. And obviously the religious Zionists are not willing to compromise on the land. That's where they differ from the centre and the left, where it's a question about where we can put a border, how much can we compromise on the land, and then what do we do and how do we integrate or separate from the Palestinian population in those cases. This definition of seeing yourself as right or left in relation to whether or not you believe in coming to a compromise in a Palestinian state was really the definition. If someone said I'm right or I'm left, that's what you would understand it as being. But I don't think that's what's on the table anymore.
Correct.
Because no one's talking about peace with the Palestinian. No one's talking about a Palestinian state in Israel. And what the definition of left and right is, I think, is a little bit outdated because I think there are other issues that Israelis are going to vote with this year. But it's also worth noting that left and right is always relative to a central position. And I think it is safe to say that Israel has moved right, but also the centre has moved right, and therefore, what's left of the left is incomparable to what the left used to represent in Israel, which was socialism and then peace with the Palestinian. That doesn't really exist anymore as a position, and I think as a result very few people really identify as left-wing. And I've seen surveys where you see the numbers that people increasingly identify quite dramatically as right-wing, and that is especially so amongst the younger generation.
And I think we have to maybe elaborate on why the Israeli public has moved to the right on the issue of the Palestinians, and especially the younger generations. Look, if you look at most of the West and you look at younger generations, they have moved to the left versus their parents. Why has the opposite happened here? When I was a kid, buses were exploding, every other week, and restaurants were exploding every other week. And so the sense of violence and the sense of fear from the Palestinians became a very, very real reality. And I don't think that necessarily you would say the Israeli public has moved right on the spectrum, but the Israeli public has definitely moved away from the idea that a feasible two-state solution can be reached anytime soon. And the tragedy is that on October 7th, that shift was, groundbreaking. These were kibbutzim who were, prior to October 7th, very devoted to peace and the peace process. These are kibbutzim that were devoted to all sorts of beautiful peace and collaboration initiatives even with their neighbors in Hamas-controlled Gaza. They had a very, very firm belief in peace. And, after what happened on October 7th, this narrative that was widely accepted on the right, okay, that we can't give Palestinians land, not just because Israel is ours for generations, right? Not just because of that religious conviction, but we can't give Palestinians land because what they could do with it if, terror groups come into power. like what happened in Hamas-controlled Gaza. Okay, even the people who are, and the one party that represents and that still says we are left is Hademokratim, the Democrats, comprised of former Labour and former Meretz, firm believers in the two-state solution, firm believers in the peace process. And if you hear the rhetoric coming out of even their leader today, Yair Golan, yes, the ultimate goal is a two-state solution. But when you talk about the urgency and when you talk about the feasibility, or is that a main ticket issue for these upcoming elections, that's a whole different question.
And it's interesting that you bring up the kibbutzim because, I mean, in terms of the Israeli left, that is the bastion of the Israeli left. It was Zionist and it was socialist and it was secular. I mean, they are the defining characteristics of the Israeli left. And so for them to make that change from their experience is obviously another move away from the left. And one of the things that I think is quite significant for this election is that there are people even younger than you who are going to be voting for the first time. And in fact, I think it's the largest cohort of new voters in Israel's history, and that just reflects the high numbers of young people in Israel. I think Israel has 30% of its population under the age of 18. I'll compare that to 23% in Australia. So there's about 500,000 first-time voters who are eligible for this election. It's a record number. I know this generation quite well because firstly, they grew up during COVID. They did grow up in the shadow of a number of wars, even before October the 7th, 2021, 2014. And also, they have only ever really had a Netanyahu-led political environment that they've grown into. And what's interesting about this group, or need to pay particular attention to, is that they define themselves as much more right-wing and more religious than older voters, and certainly than their parents' generations. And in fact, 22% of the voter roll is under the age of 29. So that's a really big group of people who are already identifying as right-wing. If you look at some of the surveys, you'll see a massive jump even from 2016 to 2022. So before October the 7th, a massive jump in people who identify as far-right, right-wing. And, the numbers of people identifying as left-wing are almost amusing in comparison. There's sort of 70% on that side and, 10% on this side. So it's not even a close to 50-50 electorate anymore. But that definition and that self-identification doesn't always equate with how they view issues. And I think this is a really interesting point. And I wanted to get your thoughts about whether you think the demonisation of being leftist, which has been part of the political rhetoric for, more than 10 years now, that leftists, there's a saying in Hebrew that leftists are worse than the Arabs. They're more enemies of the state than even Arabs would be enemies of Israel. I mean, that has been the rhetoric about being left. And I wonder if you think that has an influence, that demonisation has had an influence on people's ability, especially young people who've grown up during this time, to identify as being left. So by definition, they're going to say, I'm right, because how could you be left? To be left is a traitor. It's to be an enemy of the state. How could one say that? Do you think that's had an influence?
Absolutely. When peace was, being negotiated very seriously between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority, Hamas were set out to blow that up. And their strategy was to create violence and create trauma amongst the Israeli public. And it worked. It worked quite well. And I remember growing up after the Second Intifada, during the Gaza wars, during the knife Intifada of 2015, the many cycles of violence, and of course, October 7th, right? When so much violence is being inflicted on a society, and it does create positions where if you are dovish, or if you believe in peace, or if you believe in compromise, you may be thought of as, as a traitor. You may be thought of as someone who is delusional, and you may be even blamed for some of that violence coming in. And I think, and that violence is very much easily manipulated by political rhetoric. It's so much easier to be on the side of vengeance, and it's so much easier to be on the side of hatred, and it's so much easier to be on that side. And those are ideas that, definitely appeal to younger people.
I've always found it curious that people will say that Israeli violence against Palestinians will radicalise them, but don't make that equation the other way round, that Palestinian violence against Israelis could actually potentially radicalise them as well. One of the other things that I've noticed about the younger generation is their mental health issues and signs of PTSD, which I think is also a result of the violence that you're talking about. I guess the other thing to note about it is the information environment that they're in, which is vastly different to the information environment that existed during the Oslo Accords. And I remember particularly Ben-Gvir got a lot of votes in the last election from younger voters because people recognised him from TikTok and they didn't really know anything about the other politicians, so they just went with that because that was the politician that they knew.
Yeah, but I think, Sharon, the discussion we've been having up until now, right, discussing the spectrum of where you stand on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is very much the determining factor for the elections, let's say, up until about 5, 6, 7 years ago, okay? What we're seeing unfold in Israel right now, and specifically in this very, very dramatic election that's coming up in a few months, is that there's a new fault line of left and right. And this is the Bibi, not Bibi fault line. And what we're seeing is characters who were to the right of Netanyahu on the issue of the Palestinians. And I'm specifically speaking about Naftali Bennett, who grew up in the settler movement. He was more right-wing than Netanyahu. He was more hawkish. He was harder on the Palestinians. He was harder on land, harder on negotiations, etc., right? That was his base. He was to the right of Netanyahu when it came to Palestinians. Another big figure we're talking about here is Lieberman. Lieberman famously came to political power with the slogan, Bli ne'emanut en ezrachut. Okay, without loyalty, there is no citizenship. And that was him speaking about the 20% Arab Republic. That's a very radical opinion, okay, to the right of Netanyahu. Naftali Bennett grew up in the settler movement. Lieberman himself lives in a West Bank settlement, okay? Both of these figures are on the classic scale of Israeli politics to the right of Netanyahu. But today, they are figures on the opposition of Netanyahu who oppose him because of Netanyahu specifically, because of his character, because of his leadership, and because of his trial, which means being pro or against Netanyahu doesn't mean just mean Netanyahu himself. It also means being pro or against the judicial system and the checks and balances in place and rule of law. And so that's the new big debate. And if you ask a Likudnik today, if you ask, some family members of mine who vote for Likud, okay, and you ask them, what is Naftali Bennett? What is Lieberman? Are they left or are they right? They're going to say, Him Smolanim. They're leftists. Why are they leftists? Is it because they want to, go back to the Oslo Accords? Is it because they want, LGBTQ rights? No, they're leftists because they oppose Netanyahu. That's the very, very simple rhetoric that we're seeing today, and that's the new Israeli fault line. Are you Bibi or are you not Bibi? And you mentioned the many new Israelis who define themselves as right-wing, okay? Yes, many of them will define themselves as right-wing because they're Yemanim, okay? Which means I've got national pride, I'm not going to give up territory to the Palestinians, I'm, pro, us being strong and hard on terror, etc., etc. But at the exact same time, they'll say, but I hate Netanyahu and he needs to be replaced. And they'll even try to, say, cut through Netanyahu from the right and say, look what he did and look at October 7th and he failed and he hasn't been good at implementing right-wing strategy. Therefore, we're going to vote for people like Bennett or like Lieberman. But for people, who support Netanyahu, the very fact that Bennett and Lieberman and what we call the moderate, soft right, or the anti-Bibi right, the very fact that they are willing to form coalitions with the left deems them as lefties.
So it's not really about their own political identity, but it's certainly about the coalition identity. And I think, as I was saying, like this idea that the word left gets demonised so much that someone like Bennett or Lieberman could be called left is quite astounding to anyone who knows, just a few years back in Israeli politics that is could hardly be the case. So to a certain extent, this idea of saying they're left and they're right is really just buying into existing language of trying to undermine people who are against Bibi or for Bibi. So we've said one fault line is only Bibi, anyone but Bibi, rak lo Bibi. Another one, though, that has come out in the last year is around pro-democracy, or those who are happy to have an electoral democracy and not a liberal democracy to live in. And I think that's what we could talk a little bit about the protests. One of the things that I found really interesting about the protests that happened in the wake of the judicial overhaul legislation that came before the Knesset and the other attacks on Israel's democracy is that they really reclaimed the flag. Like, this was for them a very Zionist thing to do. These are people who also came from the right, but they also came from the Zionist left, and said that the country that they built, that the flag belongs to them. It doesn't belong to the right wing, which is usually where you'll see it. You'll see the far right taking the Israeli flag into the very well-known and provocative Jerusalem Day Parade in the old city of Jerusalem, and they go with the Israeli flag, and that's a way of like showing their nationalist, some would even say supremacist inclinations. Here were masses of Israeli citizens from really a very diverse backgrounds geographically and politically who've come out with the Israeli flag to say we are pro-democracy. We want Israel to be a liberal democracy. We do not want it going the way of other countries that have devolved from being democracy due to the centralisation of power in government and the reduction of power in the checks and balances in the media, in the civil service, in the judicial system. Getting rid of those checks and balances allows the government itself to hold all the power. And there's only one word for that, and that's authoritarian.
Very true. And I think the protest movement, what's so interesting about the protest movement that we saw, first of all, as you said, the reclamation of the Israeli flag and this sense of national pride in our institutions was big. And I think part of that was to try to kind of brush off the back this image that being pro-democracy means you're a lefty. And it was also very much a grassroots movement, okay? So when you follow the rhetoric of their leadership, they always try to say, we're not lefties, we just want our democracy back on track. We're not lefties, we're just against this authoritarian kind of control over the system that Bibi has been pushing. So as I said, the fault line of Rak Bibi, Rak Lo Bibi, the fault line of Bibi's leadership very, very much corresponds with the issue of trust in the system. And that's, I think, why we find and we found this in the government of change, with a short-lived government that, within the many roles of elections, was basically a coalition between the moderate right and the left and the center against Netanyahu. And we saw this again in the protest movement. What we're saying is these people are willing to put aside their political differences on the spectrum of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? People who believe in a two-state solution now are willing to sit in a coalition with people who have used the word annexation, deportation, okay? Which is very dramatic, all right? But they're willing to do so in order to save Israel from what they perceive as this authoritarian leader who is going to crash our democracy and who is going to crush our systems and who needs to be elected out. And so that's the glue that sticks together their ideologies. And it corresponds with the fact that, again, many people who would have defined as the left and who voted left in so many previous elections have also been disillusioned by the two-state solution, have also, been traumatized by the awful waves of violence. So that's really not really their main ticket issue anymore. They want him out. They perceive him as the person who was responsible for the October 7th massacre and horrific scandal. And they want him and his kind of leadership ousted. And they're willing to accept and swallow a leader like Naftali Bennett to reach that goal.
And I think that's reflected in the fact that over 70% of Israelis have little to no faith in government. Government rates lowest in terms of faith in institutions. The army always rates the highest and has been, but government rates lowest, not the High Court. So interestingly, the government's actually probably doing, in the Israeli public's perception, the government's doing a worse job than the High Court, even though the High Court has been demonised so much. I wanted to talk about another fault line, which is religious secular. And I think we'll get into this a little bit more when we really do go into discussing. It's around one particular religious population, which is the ultra-Orthodox, because of the impact that they have in other sectors or in other parts of Israeli society and economy. But one of the things I always found interesting in Israel is that the Jewish population is regularly surveyed along religious lines. And there are 4 categories. And one of them is secular, and the other 3 are just forms of religious. So I really thought that was really interesting. There was like one, you could be secular, chiloni, masorti, traditional, as you've mentioned, which you said is a growing category, religious dati, and then Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. So even just the way in which the Jewish population is sort of divided and surveyed regularly, and this is across national institutions and political polling, surveyed across those 4 categories, where only one of them is actually a non-religious category.
And a lot of the rhetoric amongst Israeli seculars is very anxious. We're seeing on a very local scale a lot of drama, a lot of political drama unfolding about seculars being very concerned to lose their secular identity. We're seeing, really vicious fights between neighbors, or if rabbis are allowed to put, tefillin stands next to schools. We're seeing a lot of that kind of rhetoric. Secular people in Israel are afraid for their values and for their children.
And I remember when my kids were at school, and because I went to a Jewish school, I was not that concerned about a bit of religious education here and there. But when my kids were at school, and they were at obviously a secular school, the other parents were extremely concerned about any sign of religious education, anything in kindergarten, in primary school, in high school, anything that even smelt a little bit. And that's where I think some of the opposition to Naftali Bennett as education minister came in. The idea that any tiny little bit of religious education would come into the schools was a great concern. There's a fault line around the army. The fault line around the army is around, in English I'll say it's a population that serves that doesn't serve. And that in fact means that there is people who are excluded from the army by design, the Haredim and also the Arabs, who do not serve in the army. And why that has become a particularly big issue is because there's been 2.5 years of war now. So these are not theoretical, what was called equality burden sharing arguments anymore. This is actually some people put their life on their line and some people don't. But I think this is an interesting fault line because I've seen national movements who've come out around the fact that only some of the people are doing regular, repetitive, very long-term and very dangerous army service.
This is the public that is going to determine the next election in Israel. And the public that is going to determine the next election in Israel is what we call the soft right. Okay? Because we know the Israeli public has moved to the right in general. And we know that the Israeli center is not very far than the Israeli moderate right on the issue of the Palestinians and on the issue of, religion and state in general, and of course not on economy and, et cetera, et cetera. But the big, big rifts within that particular sector of the soft right, the few percentage of Israelis who may be having a discussion in their mind right now if to vote for Netanyahu or if to vote for one of the more central right-wing parties, for instance, Lieberman, Bennett, Eisenkot, those are the names, okay, is precisely the issue of the draft bill, of the Haredi exemption from the military service, which gets Israelis of all sorts, including Likud voters, outraged, okay? This is an outrage. And again, because Likud voters send their kids to the army, Likud voters have lost children in the army. Likud voters have been, doing hundreds of days of reserve duty thanks to the October 7th war. So they are also upset about this. It's just they're willing to, some of them are willing to swallow it because they want Netanyahu as a leader. But that is one of the major issues moving voters in the soft right from Netanyahu to another place. And then the other issue is, of course, the issue of Netanyahu's trial and Netanyahu's leadership and the trust in authorities. And those are the two big defining issues. I would also add maybe who you put the blame on for October 7th and the issue of the scandal and the responsibility. So, three issues where the soft right is going to have to make a big, big determination in this upcoming election.
We do intend to discuss all of the actual election issues. In this episode, we're really looking at the way in which people define and identify themselves on this spectrum of left and right. And I think our old identities of left and right don't really fit these priorities anymore, and it doesn't really fit the changing world. And this is also true for Jewish communities who have found themselves politically homeless in many cases. Certainly many on the left, where anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have become really core defining values of those parts of politics, but also where Jewish communities have sort of thought they found an answer that they might sort of flirt with the right wing. But if you look at how parts of the right, the Republican right in America, shifted from pro-Israel to virulently anti-Israel and very conspiratorial and very overtly anti-Semitic, I think they need to pay attention if they think the right wing is somehow a solution to left-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So as Jews in the diaspora, I think we struggle quite a lot also with our political identities right now, particularly around those traditional definitions of left and right. And this is the same for Israel. These new fault lines have really been caused by Netanyahu's rule, by these anti-liberal forces, the growth of the religious population, but also by 2.5 years of war and the burden that's placed on some parts of the population but not on others. Many Israeli voters, in fact, move from party to party each election, and sometimes because the parties change. And so it's not always easy to predict who's going to vote for who. And what will be defining factors, I think, will be both the election issues but also the way in which they identify themselves. But at the same time, if left and right were sort of defined by pro-settlement on the right and by pro-compromise, let's say, on the left, that's not really what's on the table anymore. We're not talking about the conflict in this election. We're not talking about the occupation. This is not what people are going to in this election. And so with that process largely off the table, what makes someone left, right or centre is far more nuanced. And I think we'll find that some of these other fault lines that we've discussed will make their way into the forefront of the election. So we will be back to talk about the other parts of the Israeli electorate and, of course, the election issues. Give us a follow and a like if you enjoy Politica, and be sure to also listen to some of TJI's other great podcasts. There's a new season of Tensions Transplanted with Rob Kaldor and Isabel Oderberg, who do a deep dive into how the Israel-Palestine conflict has not just changed the Middle East, and they have interviews with experts looking at our own changing society. So stay tuned for more at Politica, and until next time, keep the volume down.